From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Kelsey Andersen Onofre has more for us on the presence of those disease pathogens in wheat heads as the Kansas harvest is about to open up. She'll go over the conditions that have led to head scab disease turning up in locations where it rarely is a problem and how you growers would want to manage that situation. She'll also talk about 2 more head-borne pathogens showing up in harvest-ready wheat. Then K-State's Jaymelynn Farney and Jenny Ifft will discuss the various options for you livestock producers to insure your forage resources through the USDA's Risk Management Agency. And awaiting with another Stop, Look, and Listen is K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven. All that and more here on Agriculture Today. Thanks for tuning in once again. You're listening to Agriculture Today. More on the condition of Kansas winter wheat now, and a problem that has really come on strong here in recent weeks in places that it typically hasn't been prevalent before. And that is disease in wheat heads. And we've brought by once more wheat disease specialist Kelsey Andersen Onofre of K-State Research and Extension to fill us in on just how bad this problem with blight and other things is around Kansas, Kelsey. And you have been certainly on the road a lot of places in the state, attending the K-State wheat plot tours throughout Kansas. And this is a widespread issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one that we're seeing, like you mentioned, in places in Kansas where we typically don't see a lot of head scab. So we definitely expect to see it down in the southeast corner of the state and here in more central eastern Kansas. But I think we're seeing it a bit more west than we have in past years. And also we're seeing it in that north central part of the state. And one of the reasons that potentially happened is because those weather conditions right at that flowering window, which is the only time that wheat is susceptible, were just very favorable. So that's wet weather, warmer weather, if you have those rainfall events right during flowering, and you are potentially near a source of inoculum, an older cornfield or a field that potentially had fusarium head blight in the past, those are the fields that are probably at the highest risk. So I think we're seeing it in some places where we didn't expect to see it because we had that higher rainfall this year.
Then for those producers who aren't well acquainted with it, this may be their first run-in with head scab or fusarium head blight, whichever way you prefer to refer to it. What are they looking for?
Oh, yeah, sure. What we're looking out for in the head is bleaching. So we'll typically see normal head development, and then you'll see even one bleached spikelet. You could potentially see a whole bleached head, but typically what tells that fusarium head blight apart from something else like, say, hail damage or some freeze injury would be seeing just one spikelet or 2 spikelets that are infected within a head, sometimes starting in the middle of the head. And why one spikelet would become infected and not others is because that's the one that got infected. So there was just a perfect amount of spores at the time that spikelet was flowering, and then you'll typically see it spread up from there. Another diagnostic feature of fusarium head blight is that we can sometimes see the actual fungal spores on the outside of the spikelet. They're typically a salmon pinkish color, and when it's very high humidity, they'll be very visible, and that's a very easy way to tell if you have fusarium head blight. If you've already started to have mature wheat, but you might see some residual of those symptoms, if you potentially look at the grain, you'll be able to see chalky kernels from those spikelets that were infected, or sometimes pinkish colored kernels that are lightweight. Those are typically the grain symptoms that we'll see from fusarium head blight.
And why does this matter? It's more than just a cosmetic concern, actually multiple issues with fusarium head blight, right?
Oh, sure thing. So not only does it lower yield, because you get these chalky, lightweight, we call them tombstone kernels, but it also produces a toxin. We call it a mycotoxin, and it's called deoxynivalenol or vomit toxin. And that actually, if it's ingested by a human or livestock, causes feed refusal and vomiting, hence its really unpleasant name. And that can be an issue, especially if there's a lot of fields that are affected. There could be big discounts in the region because it would be very hard to blend that grain down to acceptable DON limits.
Then what does a producer do if head scab is not only present but is thick throughout a wheat stand? There are some management steps to ease the problem, but no cure, of course.
Well, that's right. So unfortunately, there's a couple of recommendations. None of them are perfect. So there is a recommendation, and there's some research that has shown that if you turn up the fan speed a bit on the combine, you can actually blow out some of those lightweight, chalky kernels. So you could potentially, preserve some of the quality of the grain in the current season. That comes with a catch. So when you do that, kick out more kernels, which could potentially result in higher volunteer levels, which can get us into trouble for some of our other diseases like wheat streak mosaic. Also, if you're tossing out those lightweight kernels out of the back of the combine, you're putting that pathogen back into the field. So you might be helping yourself this season, but next season you could potentially have a problem. You're just putting the pathogen back out there. So again, that's something that is recommended, but it has to be balanced with the management on farm. Another thing that's recommended is, this toxin, deoxynivalenol, DON, it accumulates just the longer it sits in the field, especially if there's moisture. So the longer the plants are out there, the more vomitoxin can potentially accumulate. So you potentially can prioritize those fields for a first harvest or harvest as soon as they're at an acceptable moisture level. And that can offset some of that late season toxin accumulation. Of course, you need to balance that with farm priorities, but that would be one way to maybe limit the damage that Fusarium head blight causes in the field.
That's really what it's about, minimizing the negative consequences of this disease at this point. Variety differences, are you studying that currently in your wheat test plots focusing on Fusarium head blight?
Yeah, so there are variety differences. So none of our varieties are perfect. So there are no perfectly resistant wheat varieties to Fusarium head blight, unfortunately. But we do have some that are good. So they fall right in the middle. They're intermediate. They'll do a lot better than our highly susceptible varieties. In the document we put out every year, we have ratings for each of our varieties. So the Wheat Disease and Insect Rating Guide. One common variety that we're all familiar with is Zenda. So Zenda is one of the K-State varieties that has that intermediate resistance. There's also several varieties from Westbred and some other companies that have good resistance to Fusarium head blight. But, right, like I said, it's not perfect. So the best way is to pair that resistance with a non-time fungicide application in years like this where we have moisture during flowering. So that would be a fungicide application right at flowering. So if you pair that kind of intermediate resistance with a fungicide application, research has shown you can get up to 80% control. So it doesn't bring you all the way, but it does a lot better than, one or the other alone.
Be looking for that information post-harvest as you and your colleague Eric DeWolf and others will be pulling all of that together on resistance to Fusarium head blight in our wheat varieties. Now, the other two here briefly, one is called loose smut, and it's here and gone, typically you say, but it still is an issue.
Oh, sure. So if you saw those kind of black heads that have spores that you see really only at that heading time point, that's what we call loose smut. And so those spores will actually blow to their neighbor's spores and will infect at flowering. So you won't see those symptoms at the time of harvest. You won't be able to tell if your grain's infected. But if that seed is saved back and planted without a seed treatment, you can see an accumulation of those plants that have loose smut. So maybe you would only have a very small percentage in this season, but if that seed was saved back, you'd have twice as many or 5 times as many heads. And so you can see that would cause a slow bite away at yield. So a really easy way to control loose smut is by applying a fungicide seed treatment. There are many that are effective. It would just be getting good coverage.
and the other of the trio that we commonly talk of in Kansas, common bunt, again, something that's easily detected, isn't it?
Well, at harvest, for sure. So last year, we had really high levels of common bunt in parts of the state. And so we're nervous that, again, we'll have higher than usual levels of common bunt. And that resulted last year in discounts, actually, or rejections at elevators. And it's very easy at harvest to see because it causes those black spores will cause a smutty appearance on the actual grain. And it has a really bad odor. Right. So it's called stinking smut, right? Which is I don't like that name, but it kind of gives away the symptoms pretty well.
And the discounts can be heavy when you haul that to the elevator.
The discounts can be heavy, and it can affect overall our grain quality coming out of the region. So it's something to keep an eye out for during harvest, and those seed lots would definitely be ones to either prioritize for seed treatment or to replace for next season because it's something that will accumulate and get worse year after year.
Well, unfortunately, Kelsey, it is appearing to be a banner year for these head-based diseases in our wheat stands around Kansas. So producers, as you're preparing to roll the combine, be fully aware of what's out there, inspect closely. And if you need more background, Kelsey put together a great article on identifying disease problems and setting harvest priorities in winter wheat, again, covering these three wheat pathogens. It's in the e-update newsletter series posted this past Thursday, the 10th of June at agronomy.ksu.edu. As always, a pleasure. Kelsey, thanks for filling us in here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
She is wheat disease specialist Kelsey Andersen Onofre of K-State Research and Extension, our first guest on this Agriculture Today.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Shelby Varner. We are now well into the forage production season here in Kansas. Whether it be harvested hay or pasture grazing, there are many ways for livestock producers to ensure their forage resources. That was the topic of a recent podcast produced by beef systems specialist Jaymelynn Farney of K-State, and she was joined by K-State agricultural policy specialist Jenny Ifft. Jenny shares valuable information on different plans to ensure your forage.
There's quite a few options, and they've been increasing over time. I think the most popular one is PRF, pasture, rangeland, and forage, and that can cover almost any forage or hay, pasture, and it's based on rainfall. So if you have a local drought, you can get a payout, but it's based on a local drought, not a lack of rainfall on your field. So that's an important part of the product you need to understand. There's also something called annual forage, which is basically like PRF, pasture, rangeland, and forage, but it's only for annual forages, and it's triggered on rainfall, and it's going to be based on the value of those annual forages instead of the value of pasture or hay or whatever you have covered under PRF. So that's a big part of it. That's what a lot of producers use. You also have your multi-peril or single crop policies, which in some cases could work. You could insure wheat or corn under a standard crop insurance policy. It does get tricky if it's a silage variety. And for those, they have silage-only policies. Those are yield policies, not revenue policies. But, we do have a fair amount of silage sorghum covered throughout the state. I'm not sure about silage corn because they don't publish those numbers, but I'm assuming a fair number of our dairies would use that as well. So that's one option. The other one is something called whole farm revenue protection, which I'm going to talk about for 2 minutes, and then we're not going to talk about it again because it is relevant, but about 15 farms in the state use it. It's not real popular, but for some farms, it could be a really good option. And that covers all revenue on the farm operation. So it can cover your forages. It can cover up to, I believe it's $2 million in livestock revenue. So it's not going to work for the really big livestock farms, but you have to cover everything. There's some other rules. Does have very favorable rates if you're diversified. So if you're not too big on the livestock production side, if you're pretty diversified, if you have good records, it's a pretty good option. Not widely used, but it's always something that's worth mentioning.
Yeah, so it sounds like there is a huge list of options that folks can have to help with some of their risk management on their operations. So So what might a person look into implementing some of these risk management tools for their production system?
So I think the first thing is sort of assessing your own risk or your current risk management practices. And as far as every producer I've talked to, they're all managing risk somehow, whether it's explicit or implicit is another question. I don't know if that matches with your experience, but some folks may produce a little bit more than they need and carry inventories. So they have flexibility on that end. You could lower your herd numbers in a low forage year. You may just try to purchase extra forage in a low forage year. Those are all different practices that are pretty common in my understanding. So it might be helpful to first think about what you do and then try to think about the cost to that. Because these are things where you may not always think about the cost, but farming more land than you have to has a cost. You could sell that or you could rent out those acres. Buying in forages in a drought year could certainly be costly. I think those are important considerations. And then if you're in a situation where low forage is really going to hurt your profitability, it's really going to affect your costs, or maybe it's affecting your ability to make certain investments or to innovate in, not necessarily getting bigger, but where your operation is going to be really vulnerable to low forage. Then you can start thinking about crop insurance products and what they can do, because they're going to provide payouts during years where forage production is lower. The other important thing is that these programs are all designed so the farmer comes out ahead. It was one way of saying they're subsidized by the federal government. And over the long term, you should break even or come out ahead. There's no guarantee of that, but that's consistent with most people's experience and the data, which shows us the averages.
Very interesting. And I do appreciate that you brought up just first thinking on the managerial side, using some of those tools as your risk management. I never would have thought of having excess hay inventory as a risk management tool, but that is a great option. Did
I miss any from your side? Are there other things that folks do?
No, those are some really good ones, as we're just specifically focusing here on the, low forage production, but those are some important ones. I guess the other ones we always talk about, if you do have to cull, make sure you think about getting rid of those cows that you really just don't like, bad attitude, bad uddered, that have ever caused you a problem. That helps, because in good years, you still put up with that. In bad years, use that as a good excuse to get rid of stuff that gives you a headache. And so my next question to you is, how are some of those programs set up? For example, what types of forages can be insured, which type of operations, and, maybe location-specific information?
There's not any limits that I know of, either based on where you're located or how much you farm, for these programs. So you could have, I'm pretty sure you could insure 1 acre. I don't know anyone who's tried to do it, but there's no real size limits, and you could go anywhere in the state. There should be crop insurance agents everywhere. So the degree to which they know about specific programs may be limited. And this is not to say they don't know their stuff. I'm an economist, and if you ask me about inflation, I'm going to have to say I'm going to have to get back to you, because I don't work on inflation, right? There's hundreds of programs. They have lots of characteristics. So crop insurance agents may specialize in one thing or the other. So, find an agent that either knows about it or is willing to learn about it. And they can get you sorted out on the details. But it really should be available to anybody. There are some major deadlines, so you want to do your homework and go talk to them, not 3 days before the deadline. The big deadlines are September 30th for winter wheat or fall planted forage. You have November 15th for pasture rangeland and forage, and March 15th for a lot of spring planted crops. So I think that the winter wheat one is the next one. We're not coming up on any deadlines right now, but it's good, especially if you've never done crop insurance, to really try to understand it, have some discussions with your agent, especially with the pasture, rangeland, and forage one. It's important to understand what you're getting into, because you can get payouts in years where you don't have any forage losses, and you might not get payouts when you do have a forage loss. That depends on a lot of different factors, but it's something you should understand before you sign up.
And that's a good point. You mentioned that we don't really have a deadline coming up for a while. So it's like, why are we even talking about it now? pre-planning, meeting, communication is very important. So we really wanted to give you ample time to get your ducks in a row. And speaking of getting those ducks in a row, what types of information does a producer need to have on hand to help with setting up some of these insurance options?
Your production records are going to be important to some degree, depending on what policy you use. So the sort of the managerial questions I asked earlier, thinking about those costs, you don't need those when you go in to buy crop insurance. But the degree of records that you'll need depends on what policies you're choosing. I don't really get into the details on the records, but I always say, if you're following sort of standard good management, you're probably going to be fine for crop insurance. So for the pasture, rangeland, and forage, you don't have to document your own losses because it's not covering your own losses. So for that, you just have to basically be able to show that you have pasture, rangeland, or forage. That one's pretty simple. For the single crop policies, you're going to want to have a production history. So, ideally, so your basic, those are either yield products or revenue products, but they're going to take into account your own production history. So for that, having sort of standard production records is going to be important. If you don't have that, you have to use a county or area-based yield. And I don't think I've ever heard anybody say any good thing about that. Those are usually set lower. If you are in a situation where it's a new producer, you don't have the records, you want to get started, one thing you could do is, you might be stuck with that county TO. This is some talk to an agent about. They should know a lot of details. But if you're stuck with that, it seems low. You could still go in, buy the lower coverage levels of policies. So it's going to be cheaper. It's not going to, it's only going to cover really big losses, but you'll learn how to use the product. You'll start collecting the data, get to a point where you understand it, and you can eventually have something that's more personalized to your operation. So that's one option as well.
And I guess my final question to you is, what would you say is the main take home for a producer to think about if deciding to invest in these types of risk management programs?
Well, I think I'll get back to the point. These programs are all designed so the producer comes out ahead. So if low forage availability is going to be a problem for your operation, it's worth looking into. That's what I'd say. Definitely do your homework. There's a lot of options out there, and they're not all straightforward.
Speaking there was agricultural policy specialist Jenny Ifft of K-State as she visited with K-State's Jaymelynn Farney. That was part of the latest Dr. J's Beef podcast, covering ways to insure forage for livestock producers. Once more, for more information, contact your local Extension Agriculture agent. To listen to this week's and past week's full versions, simply search for Dr. J's Beef. I'm Shelby Varner, and we will return with more on Agriculture Today.
From the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wichman. In today's agricultural news, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack has announced additional aid to agricultural producers and businesses as part of the USDA Pandemic Assistance for Producers initiative. Earlier this year, Secretary Vilsack announced plans to use available pandemic assistance funds to address a number of gaps and disparities in previous rounds of aid. As part of the Pandemic Assistance Initiative announced in March, USDA pledged to continue Coronavirus Food Assistance Program payments and to provide aid to producers and businesses left behind. Implementation of the assistance announced yesterday will continue within 60 days to include support to timber harvesters, biofuels, dairy farmers and processors, livestock farmers and contract growers of poultry, assistance for organic cost share, and grants for PPE. The Biden administration has resolved the long-running World Trade Organization dispute over aircraft subsidies and suspending retaliatory tariffs that were a barrier to U.S. wheat exports to the European Union. Under the dispute, the EU placed retaliatory tariffs on non-durum U.S. wheat, which effectively blocked average annual imports of more than 538,000 metric tons of mainly U.S. hard red spring and some hard red winter wheat. 3 months ago, the United States and the EU agreed to temporarily suspend all retaliatory tariffs, and imports resumed almost immediately. The agreement announced this week suspends the retaliatory tariffs for 5 years, pending how negotiations on aircraft subsidies go. U.S. Wheat Associates and the National Association of Wheat Growers says that's welcome news for wheat farm families in the northern and central plains. Well, a USDA pilot program focused on water quality is expanding to nationwide coverage as part of the Conservation Reserve Program's various offerings. Rod Bain has more.
Landowners with existing Conservation Reserve Program contracts now have another opportunity to expand their conservation efforts.
We're expanding the Clean Lakes, Estuaries, and Rivers 30-year contracts pilot to be nationwide.
USDA Farm Service Agency Administrator Zach Ducheneau says Clear 30 is a water quality focused option available through CRP via the 2018 Farm Bill. And until its recently announced expansion, available only in pilot form in the Great Lakes and Chesapeake Bay watersheds. Clear 30 builds upon a producer's original 10 to 15-year CRP contract by enrolling eligible acres for water quality practices over a 30-year period. Producers with CRP contracts expiring this September interested in signing up for Clear 30 should do so by August 6th through their local FSA offices. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
In other news surrounding the Conservation Reserve Program, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has set a July 23rd deadline for agricultural producers and landowners to apply for the Conservation Reserve Program General Sign-Up 56. Additionally, USDA's Farm Service Agency will accept applications for CRP grasslands from July 12th through August 20th. This year, USDA updated both sign-up options to provide greater incentives for producers and increase its conservation benefits. Provided producers know how to interpret the information for the herd, the information gained from genetic testing of beef cattle can be a powerful tool. Kansas State University beef cattle geneticist and animal sciences professor Jennifer Borman says that record keeping is the first step in building a genetic evaluation for the herd. Borman says genetic testing is not a substitute for good record-keeping. The best way to make progress in the performance of the herd is by recording data to include birth weights, weaning weights, and fertility. In addition, working with a genetic evaluation service provider, such as a breed association, will allow EPDs to be calculated. On its own, Borman says a genetic test has limited value, but when it's combined with good record-keeping and put into a system that allows you to make genetic predictions, then it's very valuable. Borman was a recent guest on the BCI Cattle Chat podcast, which is available online. And finally, in today's agricultural news, the Kansas Department of Agriculture and Kansas State University Department of Agricultural Economics recently released the Blue Stem Pasture Report. Kansas Livestock Association Scarlett Higgins says the report is a compilation of survey information collected from ranchers and landowners in the 14-county Blue Stem Pasture area.
Results of the survey showed the average blue stem pasture lease rate reported for a 600-pound steer or heifer for the full summer season was $144.80 per head when care is provided and $118.60 per head without care. In a short summer lease, the average rate was $93.39 per head when care is provided and $85.50 when it is not. The rate for a 3-quarter summer lease averaged $120.67 per head with care and $119.67 without. Pasture operators reported charging $267.40 for a 1,250-pound cow and her calf on a full summer season contract if care is provided, and $192.87 without care. The average lease price for a cow-calf pair in a short summer season contract where care is not provided was $123.67. There was an insufficient number of reports received to accurately publish data on prices for cow-calf pairs in short summer season contracts where care is provided. The rate reported in the Blue Stem region for building a 5-wire all-steel post fence, including materials, averaged $12,818 per mile. Excluding materials, the average was $5,800 per mile. About 80% of survey respondents reported burning pastures this year. Water sources used for livestock on blue stem pasture are 46.5% ponds, 25% streams, spring-fed or spring development, 6.9% solar-powered, 6.5% wells, 5.8% windmills, 5.4% rural water, 1.9% electric-powered wells, and 1.9% hauled. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
And this reminder to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, agtoday.net, or using an app on your mobile device, type these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. By tapping the subscribe button, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. That's agtoday.net. And that's a look at today's agricultural news. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wichman. This is the K-State Radio Network.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
As I always did, I asked and listened while the agent watched me.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Had it not been for living in and working the land in Australia, I would never have understood. And actually, I do not want to say I understood. I recognize it as partly familiar. I'm talking about my experience the first time I drove to southwest Kansas, soon after I arrived in Kansas, April 1, 1974. It seems a long time ago. My trips out west did not stop with the first trip. I regularly went out west as extension agent asked me for help with local challenges. I like to call them challenges. Many stand out, and one in particular. It was to visit in the county to help a farm family to landscape their new home. I remember the home stood in a wheat field. Beautiful fresh earth all around, slightly raised against the foundation. It seemed you could see Colorado from the back steps, which led into the kitchen. The farmer's wife invited us to sit at the kitchen table. I could sense her pride, and rightly so. Her new house on an empty wheat field. Home. As I always did, I asked and listened while the agent watched me. The woman had called and asked him if there would be help, any help, with landscaping their new home. I looked out of the kitchen window at the far-off clouds. I rolled out a clean sheet of paper on the kitchen table, just as it was as clean, empty outside. In time, much could be built and probably needed to be built. Sheds, maybe corrals, and all a western farm might need. For now, it was an empty sheet. The task did not daunt me. I was well prepared. I knew what was needed. No frills at this stage. But on the wide open land with views to Colorado, a shelter belt should be a good start. On other extension travels, I'd seen beautiful homesteads surrounded by shelter belts. They had been an oasis in a wide open landscape of crop fields. Entering the windbreaks, there was a carpet-like green lawn, shrubs, trees, and flowers. There was a patio with a shade tree, a corner for children to play. It was home. Home on the prairie. It had proven to me that anything was possible with ambition, love, time, and water. Yes, water. It reminded me of the time in Australia my mom visited us when there was a dry spell in New South Wales, and in town water was restricted. Her beautiful garden was withering, and here in the country on the farm, her son was applying all the water he needed for the garden by simply adding an extra pipeline which diverted some of the pumped water to make it all look so lush. Water pumped from the Hawkesbury River, no questions asked. Sitting at the kitchen table, I knew what transformation, work, and water could bring about. While the woman looked at the paper on the kitchen table, I placed lines and drew circles. I wrote in clear letters what it meant. I explained. The county agent was intrigued. This was why he called the specialist, to help him help his people. This was extension, doing its job. The more I drew, the happier I felt. I made sure I only used hardy plant material, which would be available at garden centers in the larger towns nearby, Ulysses, Yucatan, Syracuse. Because I followed certain design principles, the job at hand was not difficult for me. I knew we had good soil which produced wheat and other crops if given water. Crops need water, gardens need water, even a desert garden. The woman offered us coffee and a slice of cake she had baked. I made sure, as I worked on the flattened paper, I did not spill. I wanted the plan to be a clean drawing, straightforward, and easy to understand and follow. As I was completing the drawing, a big, rumbling tractor pulled up behind the house, and the farmer pushed the kitchen door open and half stepped in. And I still hear the growl. He never lifted his head. His hand held the door latch, and he said, "Now, just remember, there will be wheat grown to the doorsteps." Then he was gone, the tractor roar fading as he drove away. Now remember, there will be wheat growing to the doorsteps. It seems that the woman had shrunk. The agent and I did not look at each other. My carefully laid out plan was just a piece of paper with lines. It didn't mean anything but sadness. Today, I still see that moment. What reminded me was a book my friend Lucas Bessire wrote. It is titled, Running Out, in Search of Water on the High Plains. It is a must-read. On the inside flap printed, an intimate reckoning with aquifer depletion in America's heartland says it all. Western Kansas is different. I think it is beautiful in its difference, but you have to understand it.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. Gus contributes weekly to our Wednesday edition. Before we go today, we periodically remind you that our podcast service is readily available. You can subscribe to an automatic download of each day's broadcast to your mobile device, or you can simply go to the website and listen to any of our recent past broadcasts. For all of that, go to agtoday.net. That is agtoday.net. And with that, our time is away once more. Thanks for tuning in. Please rejoin us right here tomorrow. For Jeff Wichman, Eric Atkinson here, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.